The morning fog clung to the training grounds at Fort Blackstone like a shroud, muffling the sounds of combat boots on wet grass and the sharp crack of rifle fire from the distant range. In a few hours, the sun would burn away the mist and reveal the brutal reality of what was about to unfold. But for now, the base existed in that quiet space between night and dawn, where secrets could still be kept and reputations could still be destroyed with a single whispered conversation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Staff Sergeant Rachel Chun had learned to appreciate these early morning moments. They were the only times when her presence didn't seem to irritate someone, when her quiet competence wasn't interpreted as weakness, and when the weight of everyone's expectations, or lack thereof, didn't press down on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Today would be different. Today, 5 highly trained operatives would discover that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. The alarm clock's shrill cry cut through the pre-dawn darkness at 0430 hours. But Rachel Chun was already awake. She had been lying in her narrow bunk for the past 20 minutes, listening to the rhythmic breathing of her bunkmate and watching the digital display count down the minutes until another day of proving herself would begin. The routine never varied. Wake before the alarm, dress in perfect regulation uniform, arrive at morning formation 5 minutes early, and prepare for another day of being simultaneously invisible and scrutinized. Fort Blackstone's 3rd Battalion. Headquarters buzzed with the controlled chaos of morning preparation. The building, a stark concrete structure that had been designed for function rather than comfort, housed the Army's most elite Special Operations Training Unit. Here, soldiers who had already proven themselves in conventional units came to attempt qualification for assignments that didn't officially exist. The hallways smelled of industrial coffee, gun oil, and the particular brand of nervous sweat that came from knowing that failure meant returning to regular duty with a black mark on it. Your record. Rachel moved through these hallways with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to navigate hostile territory. At 5'6" with a deceptively slight build, she possessed the kind of physical presence that caused people to look right through her. Her black hair was always pulled back in the regulation bun, secured with precisely the correct number of bobby pins. Her uniform bore no distinguishing marks beyond her rank insignia and name tape, no combat ribbons or special qualifications that might catch someone's eye. The morning briefing room filled with a low murmur of conversation as soldiers filed in for the day's assignment announcements. Rachel took her usual position near the back wall, close enough to hear everything, but far enough away to avoid drawing attention. Around her, the other candidates clustered in informal groups, their body language speaking volumes about the unspoken hierarchies that governed this place. At the front of the room, Master Sergeant Kyle Brennan commanded attention without effort. A 20-year veteran with arms like tree trunks and a reputation for breaking soldiers who couldn't meet his standards. Brennan had the kind of presence that made grown men stand straighter. His voice carried easily over the ambient noise as he reviewed the morning's training schedule, each word delivered with the precision of someone who had never doubted his authority. "Listen up, ladies and gentlemen," Brennan announced, his eyes scanning the assembled soldiers with predatory focus. "Today we're running advanced close-quarters combat scenarios. Real-world situations where your fancy equipment fails and you're left with nothing but your training and your will to survive." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Some of you think you know what combat looks like because you've read the manuals and practiced the techniques. Today, you're going to learn the difference between knowing how to fight and actually being a fighter." Rachel felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever combat training was announced. She had excelled in every technical aspect of her military training: marksmanship, tactics, communications, field medicine. Her test scores placed her in the top 5% of candidates. But there was one evaluation category where she consistently received marks that prevented her from advancing to the assignment she wanted. Combat. Effectiveness under pressure. The assessment always included the same phrase: lacks killer instinct necessary for high-stress operations. The words had appeared on every performance review for the past 2 years, a bureaucratic death sentence that followed her from assignment to assignment. No amount of technical competence could overcome the perception that she simply didn't have the warrior's edge required for elite operations. Chun. Brennan's voice cut through her thoughts like a blade. You're partnered with Kowalski for scenario training. He didn't look at her as he made the announcement, his attention already moving to the next pairing. But Rachel caught the slight pause before her name, the subtle emphasis that told everyone in the room that this wasn't really a partnership, so much as an opportunity for someone else to carry her through another exercise. Sergeant, First Class. Marcus Kowalski was everything the Army wanted in a special operations candidate. 6'2", with the kind of lean muscle that came from years of functional training. He moved with the confident swagger of someone who had never questioned his place in the warrior hierarchy. His uniform displayed the ribbons and badges that marked him as combat-tested and elite qualified. When he looked at Rachel, it was with the expression of someone who had just been told he would be working with a liability. Great, Kowalski muttered, loud enough for the soldiers around him to hear. Guess I'm doing this one solo. A few scattered chuckles rippled through the nearby candidates, the kind of casual cruelty that military culture often mistakes for camaraderie. Rachel had heard variations of this comment hundreds of times. Early in her career, she had tried to respond, to prove herself through argument or demonstration. But she had learned that defending yourself against assumptions only made them seem more credible. Better to let your actions speak, even if no one was listening. The equipment room bustled with activity as soldiers drew their training gear. Rachel checked out her standard loadout: tactical vest, training weapons with laser simulation systems, communications equipment, and the various tools that modern warfare required. Everything was meticulously maintained and precisely calibrated. Technology designed to give soldiers every possible advantage in combat situations. But as she secured her gear, Rachel's fingers lingered on the empty holster where her sidearm would normally rest. For today's scenario, they would be carrying training weapons, only devices that could simulate combat without causing actual harm. The irony wasn't lost on her. In a few hours, she would be tested on her ability to fight for her life using equipment designed to keep everyone safe. Kowalski approached the equipment counter with the easy confidence of someone selecting tools for a job he had done countless times before. His gear selection revealed his approach to combat: heavy on firepower, optimized for maximum tactical advantage. He strapped on ceramic armor plates and attached additional ammunition carriers, building himself into a walking weapons platform. You might want to grab extra comms gear, he said to Rachel without looking at her. Stay back and call out targets. I'll handle the actual fighting. His tone was matter of fact, the voice of someone providing helpful advice rather than delivering an insult. But the assumption underlying his words was clear: she would be a liability in any actual confrontation. The training facility sprawled across several acres of carefully constructed terrain designed to simulate urban combat environments. Concrete buildings rose from the landscape like broken teeth, their windows dark and their doorways leading into carefully planned kill zones. The entire complex had been built to test soldiers under conditions that approximated the chaos and unpredictability of real-world combat. As Rachel and Kowalski moved toward their assigned starting position, she became aware of the conversations flowing around them. Other soldiers discussed tactics and strategy, sharing insights from previous deployments and comparing notes on the most effective approaches to close-quarters fighting. Their voices carried the easy confidence of warriors discussing their craft. The key is psychological dominance, one soldier was explaining to his partner. You have to project the kind of presence that makes the enemy hesitate. Combat is as much about intimidation as technique. His words were delivered with the authority of experience, the wisdom of someone who had faced real enemies and emerged victorious. Another voice cut through the morning. Air, Chun's never going to make it through selection with that attitude. She fights like she's afraid to hurt someone. The comment wasn't directed at her, but it was spoken loudly enough to ensure she heard it. Command wants killers, not social workers. Rachel felt the familiar heat of embarrassment creep up her neck, but she kept her expression neutral. These comments had followed her throughout her military career, a constant reminder that her approach to combat didn't match the aggressive ideal that the system rewarded. She had tried to adapt, to project the kind of ruthless confidence that her peers displayed so naturally. But something in her resisted the transformation, some core part of her identity that refused to embrace the warrior's mindset that everyone insisted was necessary. The scenario briefing took place in a small trailer parked at the edge of the training area. The mission parameters were straightforward. A high-value target was believed to be held in a hostile compound. Intelligence suggested minimal resistance, but the situation could escalate quickly. The objective was to neutralize any threats, secure the target, and extract without casualties. Master Sergeant Brennan delivered the briefing with clinical precision, his words painting a picture of controlled violence and calculated risk. But Rachel noticed what he didn't say: the gaps in intelligence that would force soldiers to make split-second decisions with incomplete information. These were the moments when training either crystallized into instinct or collapsed under pressure. Remember, Brennan concluded, this scenario is designed to test your ability to adapt when things go wrong. And things will go wrong. The question is whether you have the mental toughness to improvise and overcome, or whether you freeze up when the situation gets ugly. His eyes found Rachel in the small crowd, holding her gaze for just a moment longer than necessary. Some people have that killer instinct. Others just go through the motions and hope they never get tested for real. As the briefing dispersed, Rachel found herself walking alongside Kowalski toward their insertion point. The morning mist was beginning to lift, revealing the stark geometry of the training compound in sharp detail. Somewhere in that maze of concrete and steel, role-players were waiting to test their skills with scenarios designed to push soldiers beyond their comfort zones. "Look," Kowalski said, his voice taking on the tone of someone offering constructive advice. "I know you've got good technical skills. Your marksmanship scores are solid, and you know the procedure's cold. But this isn't about following a checklist. When the shooting starts, people reveal who they really are. And no offense, but you've never struck me as someone who's comfortable with violence." Rachel wanted to respond, to challenge his assumption or defend her capabilities. But she had learned that words were cheap in this environment. Everyone could talk about combat readiness and warrior mentality. What mattered was what you did when everything went wrong and the carefully planned scenario collapsed into chaos. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Instead, she simply nodded and checked her equipment one final time. Her weapons were secured, her communications gear was functional, and her tactical vest was properly adjusted. Everything was ready, except for the one thing that everyone seemed convinced she lacked: the willingness to do whatever was necessary to win. The insertion point was marked by a simple, concrete barrier at the edge of the compound. Beyond it, the training scenario waited like a test that had been specifically designed to expose her weaknesses. Rachel could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on her. Not the expectation that she would succeed, but the assumption that she would fail in a way that confirmed everyone's existing beliefs about her limitations. As they prepared to begin, she caught sight of other teams moving toward their own starting positions. Each partnership seemed to reflect the easy confidence of soldiers who trusted each other's capabilities. There were no mismatched pairs, no reluctant partnerships between warriors and liabilities. Kowalski was running through a final equipment check, his movements sharp and efficient. Every piece of gear had its place, every tactical decision had been calculated for maximum effectiveness. He was the kind of soldier that the system was designed to produce, technically proficient, physically capable, and mentally prepared for violence. But as Rachel watched him prepare for the scenario that would test their partnership, she found herself thinking about a different kind of preparation. While Kowalski relied on superior equipment and aggressive tactics, she had spent her off-duty hours pursuing a different path. In the abandoned gymnasium behind the old commissary, in the quiet hours after most soldiers had gone to sleep, she had been preparing for moments exactly like this one. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the training compound and burning away the last of the protective mist. In a few minutes, the scenario would begin, and she would once again be tested on her ability to demonstrate the killer instinct that everyone insisted she lacked. But as Rachel Chun stood at the edge of the compound, her equipment properly secured, and her mind focused on the challenge ahead, she carried with her a secret that would soon reshape everyone's understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. The first building in the compound loomed ahead like a concrete monument to controlled violence. Rachel and Kowalski approached the structure with tactical precision, their movements coordinated by hand signals and years of training. But even in these opening moments, the fundamental difference in their approaches became apparent. Kowalski moved with aggressive confidence, his weapon system sweeping potential threat areas with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had internalized the warrior's creed. His radio chatter was crisp and authoritative, reporting positions and tactical assessments with the voice of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. Every gesture projected the kind of lethal competence that the military hierarchy rewarded and respected. Rachel maintained her position 3 meters behind and to the right, her assigned role as secondary operator clearly defined by their pre-mission briefing. She was expected to provide overwatch, communication support, and backup firepower, essentially, to be present without taking initiative. Her weapon remained ready but not leading, her radio transmissions brief and deferential. The first contact came without warning. A role player emerged from a doorway 20 meters ahead, his training weapon immediately acquiring Kowalski as a target. The laser simulation system registered multiple hits before either soldier could react, the electronic feedback indicating that in a real-world scenario, the primary operator would have been eliminated. "Contact front," Kowalski shouted into his radio, his voice tight with the adrenaline of simulated combat, taking fire from the 2-story structure, northeast corner. His training weapon swung toward the threat, but the damage had already been done. Red lights on his tactical vest indicated catastrophic wounds that would have ended his participation in any actual mission. The scenario supervisor's voice crackled through their communication system. "Kowalski, you are combat ineffective. Withdraw to casualty collection point." The words carried the weight of professional judgment, clinical and final. But instead of acknowledging the simulation results, Kowalski remained in position, his weapon still oriented toward the building where the role player waited. "Negative," he transmitted. "I can still fight. Just a flesh wound." His voice carried the stubborn determination of someone unwilling to accept failure. Even in a training environment, Rachel keyed her microphone, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "Control, this is Chun, the primary operator. Is down, requesting permission to continue the mission with available personnel." Her words were measured and professional, but she could feel the weight of skepticism in the silence that followed. "Chun, are you certain you can complete the mission? Parameters without support?" The scenario supervisor's question carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate training exercise. This was Rachel's opportunity to prove herself, but it was also a chance to fail spectacularly in front of evaluators who already doubted her capabilities. Affirmative control, proceeding with the mission. Kowalski turned toward her, his expression mixing disbelief with genuine concern. Rachel, you can't handle this alone. Call for backup or abort the scenario. There's no shame in recognizing your limitations. His words were meant as helpful advice, but they stung with the assumption that she was incapable of rising to the challenge. The building ahead contained at least 4 more role players, each trained to simulate hostile combatants, with realistic weapons and tactics. The scenario had been designed for a 2-person team with full equipment and mutual support. Attempting to complete it alone would require improvisation and risk-taking that went far beyond standard tactical doctrine. But as Rachel studied the structure, her mind began calculating angles and approaches that her training had never explicitly covered. While Kowalski had been taught to rely on superior firepower and aggressive assault tactics, she had developed a different understanding of combat dynamics. Her approach emphasized patience, observation, and the kind of creative problem-solving that most tactical manuals never addressed. "I've got this," she told Kowalski, her voice carrying a quiet confidence that seemed to surprise him. "Just stay back and report what you see." The first floor of the building presented a tactical puzzle that would have challenged any conventional assault team. Multiple rooms branched off from a central corridor, each offering concealment for defenders and limited visibility for attackers. The role players inside would be expecting a frontal assault, their positions optimized to engage opponents who followed standard breach and clear procedures. Rachel moved toward the building with fluid grace, her approach guided by principles that weren't found in any tactical manual. Instead of attempting to overwhelm the defenders with firepower, she began looking for vulnerabilities in the structure itself: service entrances, ventilation systems, and architectural features that could provide unconventional access routes. Radio crackled with Kowalski's voice. "Chun, what are you doing? That's not the approach we were briefed." His confusion was evident, but beneath it was something else, a growing awareness that she might know something he didn't. "Improvising," Rachel responded simply. She had located a maintenance access panel on the building's exterior wall, partially concealed by tactical camouflage but still functional. While the role players inside prepared for a conventional assault through the main entrance, she was creating an entirely different tactical problem. The sounds of her entry were minimal: the soft whisper of metal against concrete, the controlled breathing of someone moving through confined spaces. Rachel had always been naturally quiet, a trait that her instructors had dismissed as lack of aggressiveness. But in this environment, silence became a tactical advantage that no amount of firepower could replicate. From Kowalski's position, her movements seemed almost supernatural. One moment she was visible near the building's exterior, the next she had vanished entirely. His radio remained silent except for the distant sounds of movement that might have been wind or might have been something far more deliberate. Inside the building, the first role player realized something was wrong when his partner's position went silent. The training protocol called for regular check-ins, brief radio transmissions that confirmed all defenders remained alert and ready. But the expected communications had stopped, replaced by an ominous quiet that suggested the tactical situation had changed. "Position 2, report status," the team leader transmitted. His voice carried the edge of someone beginning to suspect that their carefully planned defensive setup was being compromised. The response came not from Position 2, but from behind him. "Position 2 is neutralized." Rachel's voice was calm and professional, delivered from a location that should have been impossible to reach without triggering multiple alarms. The role player spun toward the sound, his training weapon sweeping in search of a target that was no longer where her voice had originated. Rachel had already moved, flowing through the building's interior with the kind of spatial awareness that transformed architecture into tactical advantage. By the time the remaining defenders realized their perimeter had been breached, 2 more positions had gone silent. Rachel's approach bore no resemblance to the aggressive assault tactics that dominated military training. Instead, she moved like water, finding the path of least resistance, identifying and exploiting weaknesses that conventional tactics would never have discovered. Outside the building, Kowalski watched the scenario unfold with growing amazement. The electronic indicators that tracked each role-player's status showed a systematic elimination that defied everything he thought he knew about close-quarters combat. Rachel wasn't overwhelming the defenders with superior firepower, she was outthinking them at every turn. His radio crackled with transmissions from the scenario. "Supervisors, control to all stations. We have an anomalous tactical development. In Sector 3, primary operator down. Secondary operator has neutralized 4 of 5 targets without direct engagement." The voices carried a mixture of professional interest and genuine surprise. The final role player had barricaded himself in the building's central room, his position offering excellent fields of fire toward all conventional approach routes. From a tactical standpoint, his location was nearly impregnable. Any assault would require accepting casualties or calling in support, assets that weren't available in this scenario. But Rachel's approach rendered conventional tactical thinking irrelevant. Instead of attempting a frontal assault, she began systematically eliminating the defenders' advantages. Emergency lighting circuits failed throughout the building, plunging the interior into darkness that favored someone who understood the layout better than her opponent. "What's happening in there?" Kowalski transmitted, his voice tight with concern and confusion. The building had gone completely silent, its windows dark except for the occasional flicker of movement that might have been shadows or might have been something more purposeful. The final engagement lasted less than 30 seconds. When the building's lights came back on, all 5 role players were marked as neutralized, their electronic scoring systems indicating clean eliminations that had been achieved without a single shot being fired. Rachel emerged from the building's main entrance, her equipment undamaged and her tactical vest showing no impact indicators. She had completed a mission designed for a full team, accomplished it alone, and done so using methods that none of the evaluators had seen before. Silence that followed was profound. Kowalski stared at her with an expression of complete bewilderment, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time. The radio channels remained quiet except for the soft static of open microphones and the distant sound of observers trying to process what they had witnessed. Finally, Master Sergeant Brennan's voice cut through the silence. "All stations, exercise terminated. Chun, report to debrief immediately." His tone was carefully neutral, but Rachel could detect the undercurrent of confusion that comes from watching someone exceed expectations by such a dramatic margin. As they walked back toward the command post, Kowalski kept glancing at her as if she might suddenly reveal some previously hidden aspect of her identity. "How did you do that?" he asked finally. "That wasn't any technique they teach in the manual." Rachel considered her response carefully. She could explain that she had spent years studying the gap between conventional military tactics and the kind of improvised problem-solving that real-world situations demanded. She could describe the countless hours she had invested in understanding architectural vulnerabilities, human psychology, and the tactical applications of unconventional movement. But instead, she simply said, "I noticed things that weren't in the briefing." The debrief session took place in a sterile conference room that smelled of industrial carpet and fluorescent lighting. Master Sergeant Brennan sat across from Rachel, a stack of evaluation forms spread before him and an expression of professional confusion creasing his weathered features. "Walk me through your tactical decisions," Brennan said, his voice carrying the tone of someone trying to understand a foreign language. "Starting with your decision to deviate from standard breach procedures." Rachel began describing her approach, but she quickly realized that her explanation sounded impossible even to her own ears. How could she explain that she had read the building's vulnerabilities like a book, that she had understood the defender's psychology better than they understood it themselves? You eliminated 5 trained role-players without firing a shot. Brennan continued. The scenario supervisors are calling it the most efficient mission completion they've ever recorded. But your methods ... double quotes. He paused, consulting his notes. Your methods don't match any recognized tactical doctrine. Sometimes the doctrine doesn't account for all possibilities, Rachel replied carefully. She was treading dangerous ground here. Military culture rewarded innovation, but only when it came packaged in familiar terminology and recognizable frameworks. Brennan leaned back in his chair, his eyes studying her with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Chun, you've been rated as lacking combat effectiveness for 2 years. Every evaluation has noted your reluctance to engage in aggressive tactics. How do you reconcile that with what happened today? The question struck at the heart of everything Rachel had been struggling with throughout her military career. She had never lacked the ability to fight. She had simply approached combat from a perspective that the evaluation system wasn't designed to recognize or reward. Maybe the evaluations were measuring the wrong things, she said finally. The comment hung in the air between them, carrying implications that extended far beyond a single training exercise. If Rachel was right, then the entire system for identifying and developing combat talent might be fundamentally flawed. Brennan's response was immediate. The evaluation criteria have been developed over decades of combat experience. They reflect the qualities that make soldiers effective in real-world operations. But his voice lacked its usual conviction, as if the day's events had shaken his faith in assumptions he had never previously questioned. Outside the conference room window, other training exercises continued with mechanical precision. Soldiers moved through scenarios designed to test their adherence to established tactical principles, their performance measured against standards that rewarded aggressive competence and punished deviation from accepted norms. But inside the room, Rachel Chun sat quietly as her superiors tried to reconcile what they had witnessed with everything they thought they knew about combat effectiveness. She had just proven that their assumptions about her capabilities were completely wrong. The question now was whether they would acknowledge that fact or find ways to explain it away. The abandoned gymnasium behind the old commissary had been scheduled for demolition 3 years ago, but budget cuts and bureaucratic delays had left it standing like a forgotten monument to military efficiency. Most soldiers on Fort Blackstone didn't even know it existed, hidden behind a cluster of maintenance buildings and accessible only through a service road that appeared on no official base maps. But Rachel Chun knew every detail of the structures. Layout, every loose floorboard and broken window, every angle of light that filtered through the damaged roof during different times of day. For the past 18 months, this forgotten space had been her sanctuary, her laboratory, and her secret training ground. The building's interior bore little resemblance to its original purpose. Where basketball hoops had once hung, Rachel had installed a complex web of ropes, cables, and improvised obstacles that transformed the space into a 3-dimensional puzzle. The gymnasium floor was marked with tape patterns that outlined architectural layouts she had memorized from technical manuals, creating practice environments that replicated everything from urban apartment buildings to military command bunkers. Her training sessions began at 0300 hours, 2 hours before most soldiers even considered waking up. Rachel would slip out of her barracks through a maintenance exit that she had learned to open without triggering the security system, making her way through the base's quiet streets with the stealth of someone who had studied the patrol patterns of military police and learned to avoid their routes. The early morning hours provided perfect cover for activities that would have attracted unwanted attention during normal duty hours. While her fellow soldiers slept, Rachel pushed her body and mind through exercises that bore no resemblance to conventional military training. She wasn't preparing for the kind of combat that the Army's manuals describe. She was developing capabilities for situations that no training program had ever anticipated. That her approach to physical conditioning defied everything the military taught about strength and endurance. Instead of focusing on raw power and aggressive movement, Rachel had spent months developing what she privately called adaptive fluidity, the ability to move through complex environments with minimal energy expenditure and maximum effectiveness. Ropes suspended from the gymnasium ceiling served as training tools for scenarios that combined climbing, balance, and spatial problem-solving. Rachel would navigate through these obstacles blindfolded, learning to read environments through touch and sound rather than sight. She practiced moving in complete silence, controlling her breathing and heartbeat, until she could become effectively invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for her. But the physical training was only one component of her preparation. Rachel had also become a student of psychology, studying the behavioral patterns that govern how people responded to stress, surprise, and perceived threats. She had read everything she could find about criminal psychology, hostage negotiations, and the mental processes that determined whether people fought, fled, or froze when confronted with violence. Her personal library, hidden in a storage locker, that officially contained seasonal clothing, included texts that would have raised eyebrows among her superiors. Books on unconventional warfare, urban survival, and the psychological dynamics of combat sat alongside technical manuals on electronics, mechanical systems, and architectural engineering. Rachel had become an expert on subjects that the Army didn't even recognize as relevant to military operations. The most important component of her training, however, was something she had never written down or discussed with anyone. Rachel called it invisibility theory, the systematic study of how people saw what they expected to see and overlooked everything else. She had spent years observing how social expectations shaped perception, how assumptions about gender, rank, and personality could render someone effectively invisible, even when they were standing in plain sight. This understanding had become the foundation of her tactical philosophy. While conventional military training focused on projecting strength and dominance, Rachel had learned to weaponize underestimation. She deliberately cultivated an image of competent but unremarkable technical skill, allowing others to dismiss her while she studied their weaknesses and planned for opportunities that might never come. Her evening training sessions focused on what she privately termed ghost tactics, methods of movement and engagement that relied on misdirection rather than force. Using mannequins and electronic timers, Rachel practiced techniques for neutralizing opponents without direct confrontation. She learned to disable security systems, pick locks, and move through buildings, using routes that their designers had never intended for human traffic. The techniques she developed were part martial arts, part urban exploration, and part psychological manipulation. Rachel studied how to read body language, how to exploit the brief moments of confusion that occurred when people encountered something unexpected, and how to use environmental features as tactical advantages. Her research into building design had revealed weaknesses that architects never considered from a security perspective. Ventilation systems, utility corridors, and maintenance access points created pathways through structures that bypassed all conventional security measures. Rachel had learned to read architectural drawings like tactical maps, identifying routes and vulnerabilities that would be invisible to anyone thinking in conventional military terms. The breakthrough in her training had come during a weekend leave when she visited her uncle in Detroit. James Chun owned a martial arts studio in one of the city's rougher neighborhoods, and he had spent 30 years teaching self-defense to people who couldn't rely on police protection or military intervention. The military teaches you to fight like a soldier, Uncle James had told her during their first training session together. But soldiers fight in armies with support and equipment and backup plans. What happens when you're alone, outnumbered, and the people trying to hurt you don't follow the rules? His question had crystallized everything Rachel had been struggling with throughout her military career. The Army's training programs assumed that combat would occur under specific conditions, with defined roles and recognized procedures. But real-world violence was chaotic, unpredictable, and often involved situations where conventional tactics not only failed, but actually increased danger. Uncle James had introduced her to concepts that no military manual had ever addressed. He taught her about flowing water combat philosophy, where force was redirected rather than met head-on. He showed her how to use an opponent's strength and aggression against them, turning their advantages into weaknesses through timing and positioning. More importantly, he had helped her understand that her natural inclination toward patience and observation wasn't a weakness. It was a tactical advantage that could be developed into something far more powerful than simple aggression. Most people telegraph their intentions, Uncle James explained during one of their training sessions. They think about what they're going to do. They position themselves for action. They build up emotional energy before they strike. If you learn to read those signals, you can respond to their attack before they've even committed to it. Rachel had spent months learning to recognize the micro-expressions, body language shifts, and behavioral patterns that preceded violence. She practiced reading hostile intent in crowded places, identifying potential threats in shopping malls and restaurants where ordinary people went about their daily lives unaware of the predators moving among them. But the most valuable lesson Uncle James taught her was about the difference between looking dangerous and being dangerous. The people who scare you are usually not the ones you should worry about, he explained. The real threats are the ones who don't need to advertise their capabilities. This insight had shaped Rachel's entire approach to military service. While her peers competed to project the most intimidating warrior personas, she had deliberately cultivated an image of quiet competence that drew no attention and triggered no defensive responses. She became the person that aggressive personalities felt comfortable dismissing, which gave her unprecedented access to information and opportunities. Her technical training had evolved to support this approach. Rachel learned to hack electronic systems not through brute force attacks, but by understanding the human psychology of the people who designed and operated them. She studied social engineering techniques that allowed her to gain access to restricted areas, simply by acting like she belonged there. The maintenance uniform she kept hidden in her storage locker could transform her into someone invisible to COCA security personnel. With the right tools and confident body language, she could walk through most military facilities without anyone questioning her presence. Guards saw what they expected to see, a technician doing routine work that was too boring to investigate. Her language skills had developed along similar lines. Rachel spoke fluent Mandarin and Spanish, but she had also learned enough Korean, Arabic, and Russian to understand conversations that people assumed she couldn't follow. Eavesdropping had become an intelligence-gathering tool that provided insights into the real dynamics of military units and command structures. The psychological profile that emerged from her self-study would have surprised anyone who knew her casually. Rachel had methodically identified and addressed every aspect of her personality that might hesitate in a life-or-death situation. She had visualized scenarios involving violence against civilians, torture of prisoners, and the kind of moral ambiguity that destroyed unprepared soldiers. But her preparation went beyond simply hardening herself against psychological trauma. Rachel had developed what she called situational empathy, the ability to understand how opponents thought and felt without being paralyzed by that understanding. She could predict behavior patterns while remaining emotionally detached enough to exploit them effectively. Her training logs, encrypted and hidden in a secure digital folder, documented thousands of hours of preparation that no evaluation system would ever recognize. Rachel had become expert in areas that the military didn't even acknowledge as relevant to combat effectiveness: urban exploration, psychological manipulation, electronic surveillance, and the kind of adaptive problem-solving that turned environmental features into tactical advantages. The irony wasn't lost on her that while her official evaluations consistently rated her as lacking killer instinct, she had actually developed capabilities that surpassed anything her more aggressive peers could achieve. The difference was that her approach to combat was so fundamentally different from military doctrine that evaluators couldn't recognize it as warfare at all. Her preparation had been guided by a simple principle: when the situation became impossible, when conventional tactics failed, when equipment broke down and support disappeared, she would still have options. Other soldiers trained to fight with advantages: superior numbers, better equipment, tactical support. Rachel trained to win when she had nothing but her own skills and the opponent's underestimation of her capabilities. The gymnasium sessions continued night after night, year after year, as Rachel developed abilities that existed in the gap between military science and practical reality. She became something that the Army's classification system had no category for: a weapon that looked like a support technician, a predator that moved like prey, a killer who could smile politely while calculating exactly how to destroy everyone. In the room, when the morning alarm sounded at 0430 hours, Rachel would already be back in her bunk, her training clothes hidden and her breathing perfectly controlled. To her bunkmate and fellow soldiers, she appeared to be someone who had slept peacefully through the night, rested and ready for another day of following orders and exceeding technical requirements. But beneath that carefully maintained facade, Rachel Chun had become something that her superiors couldn't recognize and her peers couldn't understand. She had transformed herself into exactly the kind of soldier the military claimed to want, but through methods so unconventional that the system was incapable of acknowledging her achievement. The training had prepared her for situations that hadn't occurred yet, scenarios that existed only in her imagination, and the theoretical possibilities she had studied in abandoned buildings and forgotten manuals. But today's events had proven that her preparation wasn't theoretical at all. Everything she had learned, every skill she had developed in secret, every technique she had perfected in solitude, had crystallized into a performance that left trained observers struggling to understand what they had witnessed. The real test, however, was still coming. The emergency klaxon shattered the evening quiet at Fort Blackstone with the kind of urgent wail that transformed routine military life into something deadly serious. Rachel was in the mess hall finishing a late dinner when the sound erupted from speakers throughout the base, followed immediately by the automated announcement that sent ice through every soldier's veins. Code red: all personnel to emergency stations. This is not a drill. Repeat. Code red: all personnel to emergency stations. This is not a drill. The mess hall erupted into controlled chaos as soldiers abandoned their meals and rushed toward their assigned emergency positions. But something was different about this alert. Instead of the usual measured response to training exercises, Rachel could see genuine fear in the faces around her. The automated announcement was followed by a human voice: Colonel Patricia Hawkins, the base commander, and her words carried the weight of imminent disaster. All military personnel, we have confirmed hostile infiltration of the base perimeter. Multiple armed individuals have breached our security and are moving toward critical infrastructure. This is a live threat situation. Rules of engagement are, in effect, lethal force is authorized. Rachel felt her pulse spike as the implications sank in. Fort Blackstone housed some of the military's most sensitive training programs and classified research facilities. If hostile forces had penetrated the base security, they weren't here for simple sabotage. They were after intelligence that could compromise national security for decades. The emergency response protocols activated with mechanical precision. Blast doors sealed critical sections of the base. Automated systems initiated lockdown procedures, and armed security teams deployed to defensive positions that had been planned for exactly this scenario. But as Rachel moved with the crowd toward her assigned muster point, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The lights were going out, not all at once, but in a systematic pattern that suggested the intruders weren't just randomly attacking infrastructure. They understood the base's electrical grid well enough to disable it strategically. Emergency lighting flickered on as primary power failed section by section, casting the familiar corridors in the red glow that transformed everyday spaces into something alien and threatening. Rachel's assigned emergency station was the communications bunker, a hardened facility designed to maintain contact with higher command during catastrophic events. But as she approached the bunker, she could see that something had gone terribly wrong. The reinforced door that should have been sealed and guarded stood wide open, and the emergency lighting inside flickered erratically. She found the security team inside, but they weren't manning their posts. 3 soldiers lay unconscious on the concrete floor, their weapons missing and their tactical gear scattered. A 4th guard was conscious but barely coherent, blood seeping from a head wound that suggested blunt force trauma rather than gunshot. What happened? Rachel knelt beside the injured soldier, her medical training automatically assessing his condition. The wound was serious but not immediately life-threatening, though his disorientation suggested possible concussion. They knew exactly where to hit us, the guard mumbled, his words slurred but urgent. Came through the maintenance tunnel behind the bunker. 5 of them, maybe 6. Military training, professional equipment. They weren't here to destroy anything. They downloaded everything from the communications array and then disappeared. Rachel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the base's failing heating system. The communications bunker contained encrypted data links to every special operations unit in the Army's inventory, plus classified information about ongoing missions worldwide. If hostile forces had accessed that intelligence, the consequences would extend far beyond Fort Blackstone. Which way could they go? She asked, but the guard's eyes were already losing focus as shock set in. She checked his pulse steady but weak and activated the emergency beacon that would summon medical personnel. But medical teams would be overwhelmed with casualties throughout the base, and response times would be measured in minutes rather than seconds. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed from somewhere deeper in the base, punctuated by the distinctive crack of sniper rifles and the heavier thump of grenades. The base's defensive forces were engaged in serious combat, but the pattern of gunfire suggested the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Rachel's radio crackled with fragmentary transmissions from units throughout the base. Bravo team taking heavy casualties. Need immediate reinforcement. Alpha checkpoint has been overrun, falling back to secondary positions. Command, we have multiple breaches in sectors 7 and 9. Request permission to abandon outer perimeter. The tactical picture was becoming clear, and it was catastrophic. The intruders weren't a small infiltration team. They were a well-coordinated assault force that had studied Fort Blackstone's defenses extensively enough to exploit weaknesses that the base's own security personnel didn't know existed. Colonel Hawkins' voice cut through the radio chatter with the kind of grim authority that came from accepting desperate realities. All units, be advised that hostile forces have demonstrated detailed knowledge of our facility layout and security procedures. Assume they have inside intelligence and adapt accordingly. Priority 1 is protecting the research facilities in Building 7. All available personnel converge on that location immediately. Building 7. Rachel knew the designation, though she had never been inside the facility. It housed the base's advanced weapons research programs, including experimental technologies that wouldn't be fielded for another decade. If enemy forces gained access to those projects, the strategic implications would be devastating. But as she listened to the radio traffic coordinating the base's defensive response, Rachel realized that conventional tactics were failing catastrophically. The intruders weren't fighting like a typical assault force. They were operating with intelligence and coordination that suggested months of preparation and inside knowledge that should have been impossible to obtain. All personnel responding to Building 7, be advised that approach routes Alpha and Charlie are compromised. Hostiles have established kill zones covering both main access roads. Casualties are mounting. The transmission came from Master Sergeant Brennan, his voice tight with the stress of watching his soldiers walk into carefully prepared ambushes. Rachel made a decision that would have been impossible to explain to any of her superiors. Instead of joining the conventional response to Building 7, she began moving in the opposite direction, toward an area of the base that most soldiers didn't even know existed. Her months of unauthorized exploration had revealed that Fort Blackstone's official maps were incomplete. The base had been built in phases over several decades, and older sections had been integrated into new construction in ways that created hidden spaces and forgotten corridors. These architectural blind spots weren't documented in any security manual, which meant the intruders might not know about them either. The maintenance tunnels beneath the base formed a network that connected nearly every major facility through routes that appeared on no official schematic. Rachel had spent hours mapping these passages during her evening training sessions, learning to navigate them in complete darkness using only spatial memory and tactile landmarks. If she was right about the intruders' intelligence sources, they would be expecting defensive responses through conventional routes. They had probably studied the base's official layouts and security procedures, developing tactics optimized for defeating the kind of coordinated military response that Colonel Hawkins was attempting to organize, but they might not know about. The unofficial ways to move through the facility. The entrance to the tunnel system was concealed behind a utility panel in the base's old laundry facility. Rachel had discovered it months earlier during one of her nocturnal explorations, and she had practiced opening the access port until she could do it silently and in complete darkness. The tunnels themselves were narrow and low, designed for maintenance access rather than human traffic, but they provided routes through the base that bypassed every security checkpoint and surveillance system. Moving through them required the kind of controlled breathing and spatial awareness that Rachel had developed during her ghost tactics training. As she crawled through the confined space, Rachel could hear the battle raging above her. The sound of gunfire was muffled by concrete and earth, but the vibrations of explosions transmitted through the ground, with enough force to suggest that heavy weapons were being used by both sides. Her destination was Building 7, but not through any route that the base's defenders or attackers would anticipate. The tunnel system provided access to the facility's basement level, emerging in a storage area that was connected to the main research floors through a service elevator that appeared on no security diagram. But as Rachel moved through the tunnels, she began to understand that this crisis was far more complex than a simple military assault. The intruders weren't just trying to steal intelligence. They were systematically destroying the base's ability to coordinate defensive responses. Every time the defenders attempted to establish a defensive line, the enemy demonstrated knowledge of alternative routes that rendered those positions useless. The pattern suggested something that made Rachel's blood run cold. The intruders weren't just well informed about Fort Blackstone's layout and procedures. They were being guided by someone with current access to the base's security systems and tactical communications. Someone inside the base was providing real-time intelligence to the enemy force. The realization transformed Rachel's understanding of the tactical situation. This wasn't a battle between the base's defenders and an external threat. It was a coordinated operation involving traitors within the military itself. The enemy force knew exactly where to strike because they were receiving updates about defensive positions and response plans as the battle developed. Rachel's radio crackled with a transmission that confirmed her worst fears. "Command, this is Charlie Team Leader. We're taking fire from positions that should be behind our own lines. Hostiles are somehow getting into areas we've already cleared." The soldier's voice carried the bewilderment of someone discovering that their own maps were lies. But if there were traitors providing intelligence to the attackers, it meant that conventional military responses would fail no matter how well they were executed. Every defensive plan would be compromised before it could be implemented. Every tactical movement would be anticipated and countered. The only way to succeed would be through actions that the traitors couldn't predict because they weren't part of any official plan. Rachel reached the access point beneath Building 7 just as the sound of combat intensified above her. Through the concrete, she could hear the distinctive whine of electronic systems being overloaded and the sharp crack of equipment being systematically destroyed. The intruders had reached the research facility and were beginning their primary mission. The service elevator was still functional, its mechanical systems independent of the base's compromised electrical grid. But using it would announce her presence to anyone monitoring the building's internal systems. Instead, Rachel began climbing the elevator shaft using maintenance handholds that most people would never notice. Her ghost tactics training had prepared her for exactly this kind of vertical movement. She ascended through the shaft with controlled breathing and minimal contact with the metal surfaces that might transmit vibration. Each movement was calculated to produce no sound that would alert anyone to her presence. As she climbed, Rachel could hear voices echoing from the floors above, urgent conversations in accented English that suggested the intruders weren't American military personnel. The language patterns and tactical terminology indicated professional soldiers, but from a different military tradition than anything taught at U.S. facilities. Foreign special forces, operating inside an American military base with detailed intelligence provided by American traitors. The implications were staggering, but Rachel forced herself to focus on immediate tactical realities. Above her, enemy soldiers were stealing secrets that would reshape global military capabilities for the next generation. Below her, American defenders were dying in ambushes set by their own colleagues, and somewhere in the darkness between those two realities, Rachel Chun was about to discover whether 3 years of secret preparation had given her the tools to accomplish what an entire military base couldn't achieve. The voice of an enemy commander echoed down the elevator shaft, speaking in rapid English with what sounded like a Russian accent. "Package is secured. Intelligence confirms no response units are approaching through official routes. We have 15 minutes before the extraction window closes. 15 minutes. Whatever was going to happen, it had to happen in the next quarter hour. Rachel reached the 4th floor access panel and paused to listen for movement in the corridor beyond. The sound suggested at least 5 people moving with military precision, their equipment creating the subtle mechanical noises that marked them as heavily armed professionals. Through the thin metal of the access panel, she could hear conversations that revealed the scope of their operation. They weren't just stealing current research data. They were downloading the complete database of experimental weapons programs, including projects that wouldn't reach operational status for another decade. The strategic damage would be incalculable. But more immediately, these soldiers had killed American personnel to accomplish their mission, and they were planning to escape through extraction routes that would leave no trace of their operation. Rachel took a deep breath and began opening the access panel with movements so controlled that they produced no detectable sound. Whatever happened in the next 15 minutes would determine whether years of secret training had been preparation for this moment or elaborate self-deception. The panel opened onto a corridor filled with shadows and the distant glow of emergency lighting. Somewhere in that darkness, 5 enemy soldiers were completing an operation that would compromise American national security for decades. They had succeeded because they knew everything about how American soldiers thought, how they moved, how they responded to threats, but they didn't know anything about Rachel Chun. The corridor beyond the access panel stretched into darkness, punctuated by the red glow of emergency lighting. Rachel moved through the shadows with the fluid precision of someone who had trained for exactly this scenario, her footsteps producing no sound on the polished concrete floor. Years of ghost tactics training had taught her to become part of the environment, invisible until the moment she chose to reveal herself. The voices ahead grew clearer as she approached the research facilities. Main laboratory. 5 distinct speakers, their conversations revealing tactical coordination that spoke of extensive military training. But more disturbing were the casual references to American personnel and procedures, suggesting familiarity that went beyond simple intelligence gathering. Dimitri, status on the quantum encryption files? The voice carried the authority of command, accented English delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. 60% downloaded, Colonel. The American security protocols are more sophisticated than our briefings indicated, but the access codes provided by our source are still valid. The response came from someone positioned near the laboratory's main terminal, his tone suggesting technical expertise combined with military discipline. Rachel paused at the corridor's junction, using the angle of the wall to observe the laboratory without exposing herself. The scene inside revealed the scope of the operation she was facing. 5 soldiers in advanced tactical gear surrounded a massive computer terminal, their equipment suggesting capabilities that exceeded anything in the standard American military. Inventory. The team leader stood near the laboratory's entrance, his position offering clear sight lines to all access routes, while maintaining communication with his subordinates. Colonel Alexei Volkov, according to the name tape visible on his tactical vest, carried himself with the bearing of someone who had commanded special operations for decades. His second-in-command worked at a secondary terminal, fingers flying over a keyboard as classified files transferred to encrypted storage devices. The operation had clearly been planned with military precision. Each team member assigned specific tasks that maximized efficiency while minimizing exposure time. But what chilled Rachel most was the ease with which they had penetrated Fort Blackstone's security. These weren't desperate infiltrators fighting through layers of defense. They were professionals executing a plan that had anticipated every countermeasure the base could deploy. "Boris, report from perimeter teams," Volkov commanded, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone managing a complex operation. "American response units are still engaged in sectors 5 and 7. Our diversion teams are maintaining contact and drawing defenders away from this location. Extraction team reports all routes clear and standing by for pickup in 12 minutes. The reply came through encrypted radio communications, the signal clarity suggesting sophisticated equipment that could penetrate the base's electronic countermeasures. 12 minutes. Rachel calculated quickly less time than it would take for base security to organize an effective response, even if they weren't being systematically misdirected by inside intelligence. The enemy would complete their mission and escape, leaving behind a security breach that would compromise American military capabilities for the next generation. But as she studied the tactical situation, Rachel began to see vulnerabilities that the enemy team's confidence had created. Their success had made them comfortable, their superior equipment and inside intelligence, breeding a sense of invulnerability that left them unprepared for threats they hadn't anticipated. The laboratory's layout worked to her advantage in ways that no conventional assault team could exploit. While the main entrance offered excellent defensive positions for the enemy team, the facility's designers had included multiple utility access points for maintenance and emergency evacuation. Rachel's exploration of the base's hidden infrastructure had revealed routes that didn't appear on any official schematic. More importantly, the enemy team's positioning revealed assumptions about how any threat would develop. They had established overlapping fields of fire covering the primary access routes, positioned their technical personnel for maximum efficiency, and maintained communication protocols optimized for coordinating with external support teams. Their entire defensive setup assumed they would be facing a conventional military response, armed soldiers moving through predictable routes using standard tactical procedures. They weren't prepared for a single operative who could approach through routes they didn't know existed. Using methods they couldn't recognize as military tactics, Rachel began moving through the laboratory's peripheral areas, using service corridors and maintenance spaces to position herself for what Uncle James would have called the moment of perfect timing. Her approach required patience that conventional military training actively discouraged, the willingness to wait for exactly the right opportunity rather than forcing action through superior firepower. The laboratory's environmental systems provided cover for her movements. The facility's climate control generated a constant background hum that masked the subtle sounds of someone moving through spaces not designed for human traffic. Emergency lighting created pools of visibility, separated by deep shadows that could conceal someone who understood how to use darkness as camouflage. Through a ventilation grate, Rachel could observe the enemy team's activities with perfect clarity while remaining completely invisible. The technical specialist, Dmitri, was making faster progress than his earlier estimates suggested. The classified database was transferred to enemy storage devices at a rate that would complete the theft in less than 10 minutes, but she also noticed something that the enemy team's confidence had prevented them from seeing. Their positioning, optimized for defending against conventional threats, created a vulnerability that could be exploited by someone willing to accept risks that no sane military tactician would consider. The laboratory's power distribution system ran through conduits that passed directly above the enemy team's position. Cutting power to specific circuits would plunge sections of the facility into complete darkness while leaving others illuminated, creating opportunities for someone who had trained to operate without sight. More importantly, the facility's fire suppression system could be manually activated from maintenance panels that the enemy team didn't know existed. Flooding the laboratory with chemical suppressant would create chaos that favored someone familiar with the room's layout over intruders who were seeing it for the first time. Rachel's radio crackled with transmissions from the base's defensive operations command. Charlie team is pinned down in Sector 9. We need immediate support, or we're going to lose the entire western perimeter. The voice carried the desperation of soldiers, discovering that their tactics were being anticipated and countered by an enemy who seemed to know their every move. Colonel Hawkins' response revealed the scope of the base's crisis. Charlie team, disengage and fall back to the inner perimeter. All units, be advised that we have confirmed intelligence leaks compromising our defensive positions. Assume all radio communications are being monitored and adapt accordingly. The transmission confirmed what Rachel had suspected: the enemy's success wasn't just due to superior planning, but to real-time intelligence from traitors within the base's own command structure. Every defensive plan was being compromised before it could be implemented. Every tactical movement anticipated and countered. But the same inside intelligence that was devastating. The base's conventional defenses couldn't predict actions that weren't part of any official plan. Rachel's approach existed entirely outside the military's tactical doctrine, making it invisible to anyone monitoring standard military communications or procedures. She reached the maintenance panel that controlled the laboratory's environmental systems, just as Dmitri announced another milestone. 75% complete, Colonel. The quantum processor schematics are particularly valuable. This technology won't be available to their conventional forces for at least 8 years. Excellent, Volkov replied. Boris, confirm extraction team status. Extraction team standing by at designated coordinates. The flight path is clear, and support teams report no American air assets responding to our position. The casual tone of their conversation revealed how completely the enemy team had dominated the tactical situation. They weren't just stealing intelligence. They were doing it with such confidence that they might as well have been conducting a routine training exercise. But their confidence was about to become their greatest vulnerability. Rachel began implementing a plan that combined every unconventional technique she had developed during years of secret training. Her approach would rely on timing, misdirection, and the enemy team's assumptions about how threats would develop. The first phase involved creating a distraction that would focus the enemy team's attention in exactly the wrong direction. Rachel activated the laboratory's emergency ventilation system, generating sounds that suggested someone attempting to access the facility through the building's air circulation network. The response was immediate and predictable. 2 team members moved to investigate the disturbance, their weapons oriented toward the ceiling as they searched for threats approaching through conventional infiltration routes. "Contact possible in the ventilation system," one of the soldiers reported. "Moving to investigate." "Confirmed," Volkov responded. "Maintain overwatch on primary access routes." This could be a diversion. His tactical instincts were correct, but incomplete. It was a diversion, but not the kind he was prepared to counter. While the enemy team's attention focused on the ceiling, Rachel moved through the facility's lower level, using routes that existed below their visual horizon. The laboratory's raised floor-concealed cable management systems that provided pathways invisible to anyone positioned at normal standing height. Her movement through these hidden spaces brought her within striking distance of the enemy team's technical specialist. Dmitri was completely focused on his data theft operation, his attention absorbed by the complex process of bypassing American security protocols while maintaining connection speeds that would complete the transfer before extraction. But more importantly, his position at the main terminal made him the keystone of the entire operation. The other team members were security and coordination personnel. Dmitri was the only one with the technical expertise to complete the intelligence theft that was their primary mission. Rachel's approach required accepting risks that would have horrified any conventional military planner. She would have to emerge from concealment within arm's reach of a professionally trained soldier, neutralize him without alerting his teammates, and do it all while surrounded by 4 other enemy operatives who would kill her instantly if they detected her presence. Uncle James had taught her that the most dangerous moment in any confrontation was the instant when you committed to action. "Everything before that moment is preparation," he had explained. "Everything after is execution. But the moment itself requires faith that your preparation was sufficient." Rachel emerged from the floor-level access panel like a shadow gaining substance. Her movement was so controlled that it produced no visual disturbance to the peripheral vision of the nearby soldiers. Dmitri remained focused on his terminal, unaware that death had just positioned itself behind his left shoulder. The technique she employed belonged to no military manual, but to the fluid combat philosophy that Uncle James had learned from masters who fought for survival rather than glory. Instead of striking with the force that military training emphasized, Rachel applied precise pressure to nerve clusters that would incapacitate without creating the violent thrashing that might alert nearby teammates. Dmitri collapsed into unconsciousness, so smoothly that he appeared to have simply slumped forward over his keyboard. The data transfer continued uninterrupted, the progress bar showing 86% completion, as if its operator had merely paused to rest. But Rachel's action had been observed. Colonel Volkov had been watching the room's perimeter, rather than focusing on specific threats, and his peripheral vision caught the subtle movement as Dmitri's posture changed. Military experience that spanned decades of combat operations had taught him to recognize when something was wrong, even when he couldn't identify the specific threat. "Dmitri, report status," Volkov commanded, his voice carrying the edge of someone whose instincts were screaming warnings. When no response came, Volkov turned toward the terminal position, just as Rachel stepped into the laboratory's emergency lighting. For a moment, the Russian colonel stared at her with the expression of someone trying to process information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about the tactical situation. A single American soldier, apparently unarmed, standing calmly beside his unconscious technical specialist. "Who are you?" Volkov demanded, his weapon swinging toward Rachel, but not yet committed to firing. Professional soldiers didn't shoot civilians without clear justification, and Rachel's appearance triggered none of the threat recognition patterns that would prompt immediate violence. "Staff Sergeant Rachel Chun," she replied, her voice carrying the calm professionalism of someone making a routine introduction. "I'm here to place you under arrest for espionage and murder of American military personnel." The absurdity of the situation held the enemy team motionless for several seconds. A single American soldier was attempting to arrest 5 heavily armed special operations professionals who had just completed one of the most sophisticated intelligence thefts in modern military history. Volkov's laughter held no humor. "Sergeant, you are either very brave or very stupid. My team has just eliminated 37 American soldiers and stolen intelligence that will reshape global military capabilities. What exactly do you think you can accomplish alone?" Rachel's response was delivered with the same calm professionalism. "I think I can stop you." The laboratory fell silent except for the hum of electronic equipment and the distant sound of gunfire from other parts of the base. 4 heavily armed soldiers faced a single opponent who appeared to have no weapons, no backup, and no realistic chance of survival. But appearances could be deceiving, and Rachel Chun was about to demonstrate that the most dangerous predator is often the one that looks least threatening. The laboratory fell into a silence so profound that the electronic hum of data transfer equipment seemed to roar like thunder. Colonel Volkov's eyes never left Rachel as he processed the tactical impossibility she represented, a single soldier challenging 5 special operations professionals who had just completed the most sophisticated military theft in modern history. "Boris!" "Yuri, maintain your positions," Volkov commanded softly, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had commanded elite units through impossible situations. "Katya, continue overwatch on primary access routes. This appears to be a psychological operation designed to distract us from completing our mission." But even as he spoke, Volkov's tactical instincts were screaming warnings that his rational mind couldn't yet process. Something about Rachel's positioning, her absolute stillness, and the way she seemed to occupy space without claiming it, triggered recognition patterns that belonged to predator-prey dynamics rather than military confrontation. "Sergeant Chen," Volkov continued, his weapon trained on her center mass, but his finger not yet applying pressure to the trigger. "You have approximately 8 minutes before my extraction team arrives. I suggest you use that time to contact your command structure and arrange your own evacuation. This facility is no longer under American control." Rachel's response came with the measured cadence of someone stating simple facts. "Your extraction team won't be coming, Colonel. And that intelligence you're stealing won't be leaving this facility. And how exactly do you plan to prevent that?" The question came from Boris, positioned near the laboratory's secondary exit. His tone carried the amused contempt of a professional warrior addressing someone he considered completely outmatched. Instead of answering, Rachel moved. The action began so subtly that none of the enemy soldiers recognized it as the opening of an attack sequence. She simply shifted her weight slightly, a movement so natural that it appeared to be nothing more than someone adjusting their balance. But the shift positioned her center of gravity in alignment with vectors of force that would become relevant. In approximately 2 seconds, Uncle James had taught her that the first rule of flowing water combat was that rivers don't announce their intentions to rocks. Water simply finds the path of least resistance and follows it with irresistible persistence. Human combat worked the same way, The most effective attacks were the ones that began before the opponent realized they were under threat. Volkov was the first to recognize that something fundamental had changed in the laboratory's tactical dynamic. His decades of combat experience had trained him to read body language, and Rachel's micro-movements triggered every survival instinct he possessed. But by the time his conscious mind registered the threat, she was already in motion. Rachel's approach to the nearest enemy soldier, Yuri, positioned 6 feet to her right, bore no resemblance to conventional military tactics. Instead of the linear assault that combat training emphasized, she moved in a spiral pattern that brought her closer, while never presenting herself as a direct threat that would trigger defensive responses. Yuri was a 15-year veteran of Russian special operations, trained in combat techniques that had been refined through conflicts across 3 continents. His weapon was oriented toward the most likely threat axis, his stance optimized for maximum stability and rapid response, his mental state prepared for the kind of aggressive assault that military doctrine predicted. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for an opponent who attacked like falling water. Rachel's first contact was so gentle that Yuri initially didn't recognize it as an attack. She simply placed her hand on his weapon, her touch so light that it felt like accidental contact. But the placement was precisely calculated to interfere with his trigger mechanism while redirecting the weapon's orientation away from any target that mattered. By the time Yuri's tactical instincts recognized the threat, Rachel had already moved to phase 2 of her attack sequence. Her other hand found the nerve cluster below his left ear, applying pressure with surgical precision that interrupted the electrical signals between his brain and his motor functions. The technique belonged to medical knowledge rather than military training. Rachel had spent months studying human anatomy, learning to identify the specific pressure points that could incapacitate without causing permanent damage. Her approach was more akin to acupuncture than warfare, targeting the body's electrical system rather than trying to overwhelm it with trauma. Yuri collapsed so smoothly that he appeared to have simply decided to lie down. His weapon clattered to the floor with enough noise to alert his teammates, but his body language suggested mechanical failure rather than enemy action. "Contact right," Boris shouted, his own weapon swinging toward Rachel's position. But she was no longer where his trained reflexes expected her to be. Rachel's movement through the laboratory space defied every principle of tactical positioning that military science had ever documented. Instead of seeking cover or establishing defensive positions, she flowed between the enemy soldiers like water finding its way through a maze of obstacles. Boris was a marksman whose skills had been honed through conflicts in Chechnya and Syria. His tactical training emphasized controlled aggression, overlapping fields of fire, and the kind of disciplined violence that had made Russian special forces legendary throughout the global military community. But his training had never addressed the problem of engaging an opponent who attacked through empathy rather than aggression. Rachel's approach to Boris began with psychological manipulation that would have been impossible to learn from any military manual. Instead of presenting herself as a threat that needed to be neutralized, she projected the body language of someone seeking help, subtle positioning that triggered protective instincts rather than defensive responses. The technique worked for exactly long enough to bring her within striking distance. Boris realized his mistake in the instant, before Rachel's hand found the pressure point at the base of his skull. His weapon was oriented toward empty space while his intended target had somehow positioned herself in his defensive blind spot. "Impossible," he whispered, the word escaping his lips as consciousness faded and muscle control abandoned him. 2 down. 3 remaining, but the laboratory's tactical dynamic had fundamentally changed. Colonel Volkov and his remaining team members now understood that they were facing something outside their tactical experience. Rachel Chun wasn't just a soldier, she was something the Russian military's classification system had no category for. "Katya, maintain overwatch. Do not engage until I give specific authorization," Volkov commanded, his voice carrying the strain of someone adapting to a tactical situation that contradicted everything he thought he knew about American military capabilities. Katya Petrova was a sniper whose precision had ended the careers of insurgent leaders from Afghanistan to Ukraine. Her weapon was configured for close-quarters combat, but her mind was calibrated for the kind of patient observation that could track targets across kilometers of hostile terrain. She was also the only member of the team positioned where she could see the entire laboratory, which gave her the tactical perspective to understand what was actually happening. "Colonel," Katya transmitted through their secure communication system, "the American is not fighting like a soldier. Her movement patterns suggest training that I do not recognize." "Explain," Volkov demanded, his own weapon tracking Rachel as she moved with fluid grace between the laboratory's equipment stations. "She appears to be using some form of martial arts, combined with psychological manipulation. Each engagement begins with the target lowering their defensive awareness before the physical attack commences." Volkov processed this information with the analytical precision of someone whose survival had depended on understanding enemy capabilities for 30 years. If Katya's assessment was correct, then Rachel represented a threat profile that Russian special forces had never encountered. "Recommendation?" he asked. "Simultaneous engagement from multiple angles. Do not allow her to close distance with any individual team member." It was sound tactical advice, but it required coordination between soldiers who were discovering that their fundamental assumptions about combat were completely wrong. The laboratories emergency lighting created a complex pattern of shadows and visibility that Rachel used like a three-dimensional chessboard. Each movement was calculated to place her in positions where only one enemy soldier could engage her at a time, while maintaining escape routes that would prevent her from being surrounded. But more importantly, her psychological approach was systematically undermining the enemy team's confidence. Professional soldiers were trained to handle overwhelming odds, superior firepower, and tactical disadvantage. They weren't prepared to face an opponent who made them question their own perceptions of reality. Volkov made his decision with the cold calculation of someone who had commanded elite units through impossible situations. All remaining personnel, simultaneous engagement. Maximum firepower, overlapping fields of fire. Eliminate the target immediately. The command should have ended Rachel's resistance in approximately 2 seconds. 3 highly trained special operations soldiers, positioned for mutual support. Engaging a single opponent with automatic weapons from carefully coordinated angles, but the laboratory's environment provided opportunities that no conventional tactical analysis could have anticipated. Rachel's response began with the laboratory's fire suppression system, manually activated from a control panel that the enemy team hadn't known existed. Chemical suppressants flooded the space with choking clouds that reduced visibility to arm's length while creating audio distortion that made tactical coordination impossible. In the chaos that followed, Rachel's years of training and low visibility combat gave her advantages that no amount of conventional military experience could match. She had practiced moving through similar environments until navigation became instinctive. Combat became automatic, and the difference between friend and enemy could be determined through touch and sound rather than sight. The remaining 3 enemy soldiers found themselves fighting an opponent who had effectively transformed the laboratory into her home territory. Their superior equipment became liabilities in an environment where electronic targeting systems couldn't function and radio communications were disrupted by chemical interference. Volkov was the first to understand that his team had lost tactical control of the engagement. Through the chemical fog, he could hear the sounds of his soldiers being eliminated one by one, not the violent crashes of gunfire and explosions, but the subtle whispers of bodies losing consciousness and weapons clattering to the floor. "Katya, report status," he transmitted, but received only static in response. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any firefight he had ever experienced. When the chemical suppressant finally began to clear, Colonel Alexei Volkov found himself alone in the laboratory. His team, four of the most highly trained special operations soldiers in the Russian military, lay unconscious on the floor around him. Their weapons were secured, their equipment disabled, and their mission had been completely compromised. Rachel Chun stood beside the data terminal where Dmitri had been attempting to steal classified American intelligence. The transfer had been interrupted at 92% completion, but the storage devices had been removed and secured. "Colonel," Rachel said, her voice carrying the same calm professionalism she had maintained throughout the engagement, "you're under arrest for espionage, terrorism, and murder of American military personnel." Volkov raised his weapon toward her, but his hands were shaking with the psychological trauma of watching his entire team eliminated by an opponent who shouldn't have been capable of such actions. "This is impossible," he whispered. "You're one person. We are Spetsnaz. We have trained for 30 years. Rachel's response was delivered with something that might have been compassion. "You trained to fight soldiers, Colonel." "I trained to stop people who hurt others." The distinction seemed meaningless until Volkov realized that his finger couldn't pull the trigger. Rachel wasn't presenting herself as a threat that needed to be neutralized. She was projecting the presence of someone offering help to a person in crisis. His weapon dropped from nerveless fingers as the psychological programming that had made him an effective killer encountered something it had no framework for processing. By the time base security forces reached the laboratory, they found 5 unconscious foreign special operations soldiers secured with improvised restraints, classified intelligence that had been recovered intact, and Staff Sergeant Rachel Chun sitting quietly beside a data terminal that contained evidence of the most significant security breach in Fort Blackstone's history. The mission that should have compromised American military capabilities for a generation had been stopped by a single soldier whom every evaluation had rated as lacking the killer instinct necessary for effective combat operations. But as security personnel processed the scene, none of them could explain exactly how she had accomplished what an entire military base had failed to achieve. The Pentagon's secure briefing room fell silent as the final video footage from Fort Blackstone's security cameras ended. General Margaret Thompson, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stared at the dark screen for a long moment before turning to address the assembly of military leadership that had gathered to review what intelligence analysts were calling the most significant security breach and subsequent recovery in modern American military history. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Thompson began, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent 4 decades in military service, "we have just witnessed footage of a single soldier accomplishing what our entire defensive doctrine failed to achieve." Staff Sergeant Rachel Chun neutralized 5 enemy special operations professionals using techniques that appear nowhere in our training manuals. The room contained representatives from every branch of the military, plus intelligence officials, whose classifications were so high that their presence at the briefing was itself classified. They had all watched the same footage, but none of them could adequately explain what they had seen. Colonel Patricia Hawkins, Fort Blackstone's base commander, stood to address the assembly. Her face showed the strain of someone who had overseen a catastrophic security failure followed by an impossible recovery. "General, I need to state for the record that Sergeant Chen acted completely outside established protocols. Her decision to engage enemy forces alone, without authorization or backup, violated every principle of military tactical doctrine." "And yet," General Thompson replied, consulting the briefing documents spread before her, "her unauthorized actions prevented the theft of classified intelligence that would have compromised American military capabilities for the next decade. The quantum encryption research alone was worth more than the annual defense budget of most allied nations." The intelligence assessment had taken 3 weeks to complete, but its conclusions were undeniable. The Russian Special Operations Team had attempted to steal research data that represented 15 years of advanced weapons development. Success would have given hostile nations access to technologies that weren't scheduled for American deployment. Until 2035. Ma'am, Colonel Hawkins continued, I'm not questioning the results of Sergeant Chun's actions. I'm questioning the precedent it sets. If we begin rewarding soldiers for ignoring chain of command and operating outside established procedures, we undermine the discipline that makes military organizations effective. The comments sparked immediate response from around the room. Officers, who had spent their careers following established protocols, were struggling to reconcile what they had witnessed with everything they thought they knew about military effectiveness. Brigadier General James Mitchell, commanding officer of Special Operations Command, raised his hand for recognition. General Thompson, I've reviewed the tactical analysis of Sergeant Chun's engagement with the enemy team. Her methods bear no resemblance to any recognized martial art or combat system in our databases. How did she acquire these capabilities? The question had been troubling military analysts since the incident at Fort Blackstone. Rachel's performance suggested training that exceeded anything available through official military channels, but background investigations had revealed no evidence of external instruction or foreign military contacts. That brings us to the most significant aspect of this incident, General Thompson replied. Sergeant Chun developed her capabilities entirely through unauthorized training conducted during off-duty hours over a period of 3 years. She essentially created her own special operations program without supervision, support, or recognition. The implications hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. If a single soldier could develop such extraordinary capabilities through independent study and training, what did that say about the effectiveness of official military development programs? Master Sergeant Kyle Brennan, who had flown in from Fort Blackstone specifically for this briefing, stood to address the assembly. His weathered face showed the confusion of someone whose professional assumptions had been completely overturned. General, I need to admit that every evaluation one completed on Sergeant Chun rated her as unsuitable for combat operations. My assessments consistently noted her lack of aggressive instinct and reluctance to engage in violent confrontation. He paused, consulting notes that seemed to contradict themselves. Those evaluations were apparently completely wrong. Were they wrong, Master Sergeant? General Thompson asked. Or were they measuring the wrong qualities? The question struck at the heart of everything the military thought it knew about identifying and developing warrior capabilities. For generations, combat effectiveness had been equated with aggressive instinct, physical dominance, and the willingness to apply overwhelming force to tactical problems. But Rachel Chun had demonstrated a different approach to warfare, one that emphasized psychological understanding, environmental adaptation, and the kind of creative problem-solving that transformed weaknesses into advantages. Dr. Sarah Williams, the Pentagon's chief military psychologist, had been studying Rachel's case since the Fort Blackstone incident. Her preliminary findings challenged fundamental assumptions about warrior psychology that had guided military training for decades. General, Dr. Williams reported, our psychological assessment suggests that Sergeant Chun's approach to combat is based on empathy rather than aggression. She appears to understand her opponent's psychology well enough to predict their responses and exploit their assumptions. Explain the practical implications, General Thompson requested. Traditional combat training emphasizes overwhelming the enemy through superior force, speed, and aggression. Sergeant Chun's approach emphasizes understanding the enemy well enough to defeat them without direct confrontation. It's the difference between breaking down a door and finding the key. The analogy resonated through the briefing room as officers began to understand that they might be witnessing the emergence of an entirely new approach to military operations. But the most significant revelation came from an unexpected source. FBI counterintelligence had completed their investigation into how Russian special operations had gained access to Fort Blackstone's classified research, and their findings had implications that extended far beyond a single security breach. Special Agent Michael Torres addressed the assembly with the grim authority of someone reporting on betrayal at the highest levels. General, our investigation has identified 17 American military personnel who provided intelligence to the Russian operation. The conspiracy included officers at the colonel level and extended through multiple bases across the continental United States. The room erupted in shocked murmurs as the scope of the treason became clear. This hadn't been a simple intelligence theft. It was a coordinated effort to compromise American military capabilities that had been years in the making. How was this conspiracy discovered? General Thompson asked. Sergeant Chun's recovery of the enemy team's communication equipment provided access to their operational files. The Russians had documented their American contacts extensively, apparently as insurance against future betrayal. The irony was profound. Rachel's unauthorized actions had not only stopped the intelligence theft, but had exposed a network of traitors that conventional counterintelligence had failed to detect. What is the current status of the identified conspirators? General Thompson inquired. All 17 individuals are in federal custody. Their trials will be conducted under military jurisdiction, with charges including treason, espionage, and accessory to murder of American military personnel. The legal proceedings would take months to complete, but the strategic implications were already clear. The Russian intelligence operation had been completely compromised, their American assets neutralized, and their understanding of American military capabilities proven to be fatally flawed. But the most significant consequence of the Fort Blackstone incident was the fundamental questions it raised about how the military identified and developed exceptional personnel. General Thompson turned to address the assembled officers with the gravity of someone announcing a shift in doctrine that would affect military operations for the next generation. Ladies and gentlemen, we are facing a paradigm shift in how we understand combat effectiveness. Sergeant Chun has demonstrated capabilities that our current training programs don't recognize, don't develop, and apparently don't even measure correctly. She paused, allowing the implications to settle before continuing. Effective immediately. We will be establishing a new research program to study unconventional combat methodologies and alternative approaches to warrior development. This program will be classified at the highest levels and will report directly to the Joint Chiefs. The announcement represented the most significant change in military training philosophy since the establishment of modern special operations. The Army would begin looking for soldiers like Rachel Chun instead of dismissing them as unsuitable for combat roles. But perhaps more importantly, the incident had revealed that the most dangerous enemies often came from within, and that the most effective defenders might be those who looked least threatening. 6 months later, Rachel stood before a classroom at the newly established Advanced Tactical Studies Institute in Colorado Springs. The facility had been built specifically to develop the kind of unconventional capabilities that her actions at Fort Blackstone had revealed as possible. Her uniform now displayed the silver oak leaves of a lieutenant colonel, a promotion that had been expedited through channels that normally required decades to navigate. But more significant than her rank was the assignment that came with it: Director of Unconventional Combat Development. The students in her classroom represented a carefully selected group of soldiers who had been identified as possessing the psychological flexibility and creative intelligence necessary for the kind of training that conventional programs couldn't provide. Combat effectiveness, Rachel told her students, isn't about being the strongest or the most aggressive. It's about understanding your environment and your opponents well enough to achieve victory through the most efficient means possible. Among her students sat Lieutenant Jennifer Park, whose early evaluation had noted her excessive reliance on analytical thinking and insufficient warrior instinct. Under the old system, she would have been relegated to support roles despite possessing exactly the kind of intelligence that unconventional warfare required. "Colonel Chun," Lieutenant Park asked, "how do we develop the confidence to act outside established procedures when everything in our training emphasizes following orders and adhering to doctrine?" Rachel smiled, remembering her own struggles with the same question. "You develop that confidence by becoming so thoroughly prepared that you know more about the situation than the people giving you orders. Competence creates authority, not the other way around." The training program that Rachel developed bore no resemblance to conventional military instruction. Students learned psychology, architecture, electronics, and human anatomy alongside traditional military subjects. They practiced moving through urban environments, reading body language, and identifying the psychological vulnerabilities that conventional tactics couldn't exploit. More importantly, they learned to think like their enemies, to understand motivations, predict responses, and identify weaknesses that aggression alone could never discover. The program's first graduates would deploy to operations worldwide, carrying with them capabilities that hostile forces had no framework for understanding or countering. They would be invisible until the moment they chose to act, and unstoppable once they committed to action. But the true measure of the program's success wasn't in the capabilities it developed, it was in the fundamental shift it represented in how the military understood the nature of warfare itself. Uncle James visited the Institute during its first graduation ceremony, his weathered face showing pride as he watched his former student address a new generation of unconventional warriors. "You've created something remarkable here," he told Rachel as they walked across the campus where soldiers learned to become invisible predators. "I've just proven that there are different ways to serve," Rachel replied. "The military is finally learning that strength comes in forms they never recognized." As the sun set over the Colorado mountains, painting the Institute's buildings in shades of gold and crimson, Rachel reflected on the journey that had brought her from an overlooked weapon systems officer to the architect of a new approach to military service. The evaluations that had once dismissed her as lacking killer instinct now seemed like relics from an earlier age, bureaucratic fossils that had measured the wrong qualities and missed the most important capabilities entirely. She had proven that the most dangerous person in any confrontation might be the one everyone underestimated, the one who smiled politely while calculating exactly how to achieve victory through methods that conventional thinking couldn't anticipate. The transformation was complete, but the work was just beginning. In classrooms and training facilities across the world, a new generation of soldiers was learning that warfare wasn't about who could apply the most force. It was about who could understand the situation deeply enough to apply exactly the right amount of force in precisely the right place at exactly the right time. And at the center of it all was Rachel Chun, the soldier they had dismissed as lacking killer instinct, who had saved American national security by proving that the deadliest predators are often the ones that look most like prey. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.